Perhaps the results of the reformist decade of the 1900s show just why it had been put off for so long. To change what was left of the Qing ultimately was to destroy it. Finally, belatedly, the Qing realized that the ancient monarchy was not up to the task of being a modern state. It needed a modern central army, not a series of uncoordinated provincial ones. It needed a more workable means by which political decisions could be made for this vast and ever more complicated country. It needed to invigorate the economy and set down laws by which capital could be concentrated and used for the creation of industry. And crucially, it needed some means of having the best and brightest in China to be trained not only in the bases of Chinese civilization, but also in Western science and math and so on. To be sure, in the late 19th and early 20th century, many young Chinese had begun to study Western science and math and technology in schools outside of the academies preparing individuals for the examination. But they were not yet part of the mainstream. In a flurry of a few years, the Qing launched radical reforms in all of these areas with some very significant effects. Significant enough, it must be said, that the Qing itself would be largely irrelevant to these processes by the end of the decade. There were, however, problems in every aspect of reform. The Qing did create a new, modern army, but it was no longer an army of morally committed Confucians, or at least led by morally committed Confucians, but rather professionals, army lifers, who would obey their officers and not a higher calling. The reformers tried to create a unified railway system, but ran up against the fact that the provinces, having enjoyed ever greater autonomy in the late 19th century, were not about to give it up easily. In government, there were efforts to hold elections, but with elections came also the means of institutionalizing provincial interests at the national level. When a National Assembly finally met in Beijing in 1910, it aimed to constitute a new government no longer automatically beholden to the Qing. And this dissolution of allegiance was related to perhaps the most important reform, the decision to end the ancient examination system suddenly and completely. Just about everyone recognized the weaknesses of the examination system by the early 20th century. But it had been used by a succession of dynasties to preserve classical orthodoxy, to recruit civil servants, and to keep local elites aligned toward the cultural and political capital of the empire. Once it was gone, the gentry's ties with the monarchy automatically withered. And with it withered the foundation, the social and cultural foundation of the Qing dynasty, which would dissolve in a series of provincial declarations of independence in 1911 and 1912. And then think of the surprise to young Chinese who had been preparing all their young lives for the traditional examination. They were now told that they had spent their time preparing for the wrong examination. The Qing reforms began a process of state building in China that continues today. Chinese regimes are still grappling with successors to this ancient examination system, to find a means by which China's most talented youth can again, first and foremost, serve the state. But after 1911, that would be the problem of other governments. With this talk comes to an end over 2,000 years of imperial Chinese history. The Qing dynasty fell. Many dynasties had fallen before it. But this time there was a difference. This time it would not be replaced, at least in formal terms, by a new dynasty, but by a series of new ideas of how to organize government, mostly non-Chinese ideas. The imperial idea and the whole set of institutions associated with it would ultimately disappear. And they would disappear in part because a different idea was beginning to take its place. The idea of a nation, a Chinese nation, which was more important and more permanent than any imperial house. The Qing disappeared also because of increasingly justifiable suspicions that the Manchu dynasty was not the best one entrusted to the salvation of the Chinese people. Or worse, the suspicion that the Manchus were presiding over the humiliation and potential destruction of the Chinese race. The Manchus, who had brought the empire's borders to new breadths and gave the empire great prosperity, had now witnessed China's descent into the ranks of underdeveloped countries. With the exception of the entourage of Henry Puyi, who was allowed to live in the Forbidden City with his eunuchs and concubines, the Manchus were largely escorted back to their homelands in Manchuria, whence they had come 268 years earlier and where they would vanish without a trace.